Get in Fakhirum, just go around. The Schlieffen Plan was the brainchild of Alfred von Schlieffen, the chief of the German Imperial General Staff from 1891 to 1906. The plan was first constructed and took shape in 1905. The idea was to find a new general war plan to take into account the many factors that had arisen since 1871 and the Franco-Prussian War. The factors were Germany's diplomatic isolation, which only left Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire as allies in an upcoming war. This created a two-front war problem as Austria-Hungary's enemies were to the south and to the east. Now Germany had to contend with a war with Russia, and war with Russia meant war with France. Triple Entente. The advancement of military training and weapons were also a factor. Machine guns, accurate modern artillery. Planes were not deadly yet, but still were great for recon. Even the communications had improved. What took hours could be relayed in minutes. The biggest factor was nationalism, and the size of an army. It was in the millions. The Schlieffen Plan was designed to compensate for the fact that Germany may be outnumbered 5-3. Thus, no war of attrition would be winnable. It was to avoid this future, plus, France was the arch-enemy, and would try to get back what was hers, Alsace-Lorraine. You do not take up a defensive posture against France. So, let's look at the actual plan. 7/8 of the troops who were going to be deployed on the west were going to circumvent the strong French defenses by just going around. They will pass through what was Belgium and then parts of the Netherlands to achieve this. The Germans knew that just marching through Belgium might bring Britain into the war, since Britain and Germany were at the table to protect and respect Belgian neutrality. The remainder will hold the German-Franco border as a distraction, as the northern troops would outflank them and then encircle them. Then they would flank and take Paris as the French will withdrew to the south. After this success, the remainder of the troops would be sent to the east to deal with the Russian bear. There was no real plans for Russia, and that was one of the faults. The plan was to be so swift that Russia would just be outmatched by the Germans coming east, and with help from Austria-Hungary, match the Russian numbers. Schlieffen was not the chief of staff by 1914. That position was given to Helmut von Moltke, the younger. He made his own adjustments to the plan. He changed the plan to only include invading Belgium and not the Netherlands. He wanted to be on good terms with the Netherlands as he wanted a supply corridor and a potential ally. Also, the defense of East Prussia was greater than 7/8 of the troops on the west. The Russians weren't so backwards by 1914, a change for the better at the Battle of Tannenberg. If you know by watching World War I videos, the Great War, or even just reading, or even just school, that plan failed. But why did it fail? Could it have succeeded? What Germany hoped to avoid, she got herself into: a two-front war with attrition and with the mighty Britain. Number 1. Men. Though Germany had more men than France in 1914, it was not enough to encircle the French properly, to take Paris or even send the rest to the French south. The casualties would not be replaced as easily. While the French and British could have colonial troops or even just have white settlers, the Germans only had the men in their borders. Also, the Germans were well armed like everyone else, but the Red Echelon troops were not. So when it came time for the reserves to come up, they were not properly trained with the new equipment, so they didn't have knowledge on the artillery or even machine guns, and they did not even know what the plan was. Number 2. Speed. To get to Paris before Britain arrived, you need speed, and speed relied on trains and transportation. Railroads did not go everywhere though, and Germany had 5,000 cars by the beginning of 1914 and 1.4 million horses, but by far the most effective way to move troops was by rail, so you can only go where the rails go. The Belgians and the French simply just blew up the railway tracks, so this meant they had to take time to lay out the tracks again, and the defenders were waiting, which meant this was going to be a slow process. You couldn't really go anywhere important without it. Then the railway issues were also a big supply issues. Much like the railways, they were inflexible, and the Schlieffen Plan itself was inflexible. One track, one single-minded, flank and take the capital, that was it. Once it was in motion, there was no turning back, no new plans. The movement was so tight that any delays or any movement against the plan would bring the whole plan down. The train part of the plan did not account for delayed trains or even destroyed tracks. Then, the Belgian defenders held off the Germans for 2 weeks, when they were to take Liège in 2 days, which tied up troops, supplies, and prevented the Germans from losing the Belgian railway until Liège fell. And when they captured Liège, the plan was already breaking apart. Communication. While communication had advanced rapidly, there were still runners, dogs, and even pigeons, as radios and telegraphs and even telephones were still unreliable and very expensive. Germany was still on the same level as the other powers when it came to communication. The problem was radios and telephones got more scarce the further you got to the front. Right at the front there were still pigeons and flags. The radios and telephones were so valuable and so expensive, and still they needed lines to communicate, so when artillery or even enemies taking the camp or trench soon, they would capture them for themselves, meaning line wire and commanders were much more valuable than the troops. This meant the messages that took hours that turned into minutes, meant that messages that would be relayed in minutes took hours, as high command made plans based on outdated situations. The biggest mistake was actually the Russians to the east. The original Schlieffen plan did not account for Russia, or that Russia with its massive size would take months to even mobilize. Even dismissing it as a strong enemy, Russia was still feeling the sting from the Russo-Japanese War. All the powers thought that Russia was still weak, but after that defeat, Russia went into rapid modernization mode, as the Schlieffen plan did not account for the Russians to be on the same level as the Germans by the war. Russia was the first to mobilize actually, putting even more pressure to secure the eastern border and East Prussia, and the flank in the west, to be successful and swift. This also forced him, von Moltke the Younger, to send troops from the west to the east, leaving less men to take France. The Germans who bordered the east, and the Bavarians were a very logical choice to send to the east. They were already close to the east, and they would defend their homeland from the Slavs and the Cossacks. Also, the Bavarians rather defend Bavaria than Prussia. The generals were not listening to von Moltke as well. And in war and in life, sometimes everything does not go according to plan, but they were still to follow the basic Schlieffen plan. The thing about Germany was, well, they were already unified and still sort of a German-speaking union. In peacetime, the armies were federal, and to defend Lower Saxony, Bavaria, Cologne, or even Berlin. But in wartime, all Germans from Lower Saxony to the Schleswigs were under a German flag, and some Germans and crown princes did not like that, especially Crown Prince Rupert, who was tasked to just keep the French occupied and went on the offensive, which was not part of the plan at all. Also, a German officer told the French of the plan, so they could retreat and strengthen in the north. Sieges, battles, and things that should not have been fought, logistical errors, poor communication, and of course transport, actually put the Schlieffen plan in jeopardy way before the Battle of the Marne. And the Western Front, and the 4 years of trench warfare, is history. It was inflexible, didn't account for time wasting or even the Russians, or even Germany not following the orders, and of course spies and informants which thought the Schlieffen plan was already working and they were just telling what was happening. The plan was doomed to fail from the start. The plan was doomed to fail from the start, but it was the only plan they had in August 1914. Yeah, just some precautions and some predictions and even just some anticipations and just hopefulness of the Aufmarsch und, or the Deployment 1. So Aufmarsch und, or Deployment 1 West, anticipated the isolation of the Franco-German War, in which Germany might be assisted by the Italian attack on the Franco-Italian border and by the Italians and the Austro-Hungarian forces in Germany. It was assumed that France would be on the defensive because their troops would be generally and greatly outnumbered. To win the war, Germany and its allies would have to attack France after the deployment of the entire German army on the west. Then they would attack through Belgium and then Luxembourg with virtually the entire German army. The Germans would then rely on the Austro-Hungarians and the Italian contingents formed around a Kada, or frame of German troops to hold the fortresses along the Franco-German border. Aufmarsch und, or Deployment 1 West, became less feasible as the military power of the Franco-Russian alliance increased and Britain aligned with France, making Italy unwilling to support Germany. Aufmarsch 1 West was dropped when it became clear that the isolated Franco-German war was impossible and that Germany's allies would not intervene. Aufmarsch die West. Aufmarsch die West, or Deployment 2 West, anticipated a war between the Franco-Russian Entente and Germany, with Austria-Hungary supporting Germany and Britain preparing to join the Entente. Italy was only accepted to join Germany if Britain remained neutral. 80% of Germany's army 80% of Germany's army would operate in the west and 20% in the east. France and Russia were expected to attack simultaneously because they had the larger force. Germany would then execute an active defense in at least the first operation campaign of the war. German forces would mass against the French invasion force and defeat with a counter-offensive, while conducting a conventional defense against the Russians. Rather than pursue the retreating French army over the border, 25% of the German forces in the west, 20% of the German army in total, will be transferred to the east for the counter-offensive against the Russian army. Aufmarsch 2 became the main German deployment plan and the actual Grade A Schlieffen plan of World War I, as the French and Russians expanded their army and the German strategic situation deteriorated. Germany and Austria-Hungary being unable to increase their military spending to match their rivals. Aufmarsch und Ost, or Deployment 1 East. Aufmarsch und Ost, or Deployment 1 East, was a war between the Franco-Russian Entente and Germany, with Austria-Hungary supporting Germany and Britain perhaps joining the Entente. Italy was only expected to join Germany if Britain remained neutral, so this is where the plan switched up. 60% of the German army would be deployed to the west and 40% to the east. France and Russia would attack simultaneously because they had the larger force, and Germany would execute an active defense in at least the first operation campaign of the war. But this is where it gets tricky. German forces would then mass against the Russian invasion force, and rather than pursue the Russians over the border, 50% of the German force in the east, about 20% of the German army at the time, would be transferred to the west for the counterattack against France. Aufmarsch und Ost became a secondary deployment plan, as it was feared that the Russians might actually get to East Prussia first. Aufmarsch und Ost became a secondary deployment plan, as it was feared a French invasion force would be too well established to be driven from Germany, or at least inflict great losses on the Germans. The counter-offensive against France was also seen as a more important operation, since the French would be less able to replace their losses than the Russians, and it would result in a greater number of prisoners being taken. Aufmarsch dos Ost, or Deployment Plan 2 East, was a contingent for the isolated Russo-German War, in which Austria-Hungary might support Germany. The plan assumed that France would be neutral at first, and possibly attack Germany later. If France helped Russia, then Britain might join, and if that did happen, Italy would be expected to remain neutral. About 60% of the German army would then operate in the west, and 40% in the east. Russia would then begin an offensive because of its larger army, and in the anticipation of a French involvement, but if not, the German army would attack. After the Russian army had been defeated, the German army in the east would pursue the remnants of the Russians. The German army in the west might stay on the defensive, perhaps conducting a counter-offensive but without reinforcements from the east. Aufmarsch dos Ost became a secondary deployment plan when the international situation made an isolated Russo-German war more impossible. Aufmarsch dos Ost was then shelved like Aufmarsch dos Unts. Aufmarsch die Ost had the same flaws as Aufmarsch und Ost, in that it feared a French offensive would be harder to defeat if not countered with greater force, either slower in the Aufmarsch und Ost or greater force and quicker as an Aufmarsch dos West. And there you have it, guys, the complete version of the Schlieffen plan and some logistical, maybe, I don't know what you call them, I forgot what you call them, but that is basically the Schlieffen plan. Hope you guys enjoyed, hope you learned something, and I might do an alternate history and what if the Schlieffen plan succeeded. Yes, very original, I know, but let's take into account this list as well, and let's see where it goes. And probably that might bring a little bit more spice into the Germany might just be a world power, whatever. So let's see that. It'll be kinda laid back, so sorry. Anyways, hope you enjoyed, hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the next episode. This would have very minimum editing because I did it pretty good, but only probably noise would be edited out. And this is unofficial but still great information to learn, so I would still make sure that it's proper. So enjoy, learn something. German is getting pretty good. I'm turning into a Nazi. Ooh, you better watch out. Anyway, guys, learn something.